Greetings. My name is Art Carden. I am an economist. I teach economics at Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama. And your classmate Calvin has asked me a couple of questions, specifically, why study economics and why study Austrian economics, which is an intellectual tradition of which I guess I'm sort of a part, and an intellectual tradition from which I find a lot of inspiration. So first and foremost, the big question is why study economics? The reason that I study economics and why I think economics is so awesome is because it is a fundamentally revolutionary way of looking at the world. So much of human life, specifically so much of social life, makes sense in light of some of the basic principles of economics. People act. They try to do what they can with what they have where they are, to paraphrase Theodore Roosevelt. They try to make the world a better place however they choose to define it. That ultimately means that they respond to incentives. And given that people respond to incentives, they respond to the cost and benefits of different courses of action, we can make predictions about the effects of different policies, about the effects of different technologies. We can formulate explanations for historical phenomena that are closer to correct than a lot of things that came before. It's important to note, too, that there is no such thing as a free lunch. You might have heard that from someone who is versed at least somewhat in the economic way of thinking. And that, too, can help us evaluate lots and lots of different proposals, like proposals for stimulus spending, or proposals to build, say, a new baseball stadium or a new football stadium or something like that. Often, this revolutionary way of looking at the world, when we recognize that people respond to incentives, when we recognize that there's no such thing as a free lunch, helps us understand that a lot of promises about the great things that will happen if we give government more money or if we give government more power are not quite everything that they're cracked up to be. That leads to kind of a second thing that I find really useful about economics. In addition to it being a revolutionary way of looking at the world, it's also kind of a universal intellectual solvent that allows us to evaluate a lot of people's claims about the way the world works. The sad truth is that a lot of the things you probably read in the newspaper or that come across your Facebook feed, or even a lot of things you might have learned in classes, are just flat out wrong. I mean, they're flat out wrong in that they get the history wrong, they get the theory wrong, they get the facts wrong. And by understanding economics, we can better get the theory right, we can better get the facts right, and we can actually come to understand this world that we live in. I've also been asked why Austrian economics as such. I won't bore you with a lot of details about the Austrian school, but the term Austrian was used to describe a bunch of economists working at the University of Vienna, and it was a term of derision. It was sort of like in the Bible when Nathaniel hears about Jesus and says, well, can anything good come out of Nazareth? In much the same way, people are looking at the ideas coming from the Austrian school and saying, oh, those are very Austrian ideas, because all of the leading thinkers of the day were in Germany. So it's an intellectual tradition that dates back to Karl Menger, and in the 20th century, its most prominent thinkers were Ludwig von Mises, author of a book called Human Action, published in the late 1940s, and Friedrich Hayek, author of a bunch of different things, including a book called Individualism and Economic Order, and winner of the Nobel Prize in the 1970s for his work on why we have business cycles. The major things that attract me to Austrian economics are, one, the detailed explanations that Austrian economics offers for how prices get things right. Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, they knew socialism didn't work while socialism was still cool. In the 1920s, even, Mises is pointing out, look, you cannot have a socialist system where you have rational economic calculation. Meaning, you can't have a world where you don't have private ownership of the means of production in which people can then rationally calculate. Meaning that you can't have a world in which people can produce and know that they're making the best uses of the resources at their disposal. Economic calculation happens or economic calculation can be rational when we have private ownership of the means of production. Therefore, we have trade of the means of production. Therefore, we have prices for the means of production. Therefore, we have profits and losses. Profits tell us that we're making the most of what we have. Losses, meanwhile, tell us that we're doing something in a way that leaves more urgent wants unsatisfied. An example I use in class is imagine someone makes a smoothie out of salmon and sauerkraut. it's probably going to be pretty disgusting. The losses that person would earn will be the market's way of telling him or her that that salmon and that sauerkraut would be better used in some other line of production. A second thing that attracted me to Austrian economics, and another reason why I think studying Mises and Hayek is really important, is that not only does it tell us how prices get things right, it also tells us how prices can get things wrong. And specifically, prices can get things wrong when a central bank manipulates the money supply, or when we mess around with the banking system in some form or fashion. One of the more important prices in the economy is the interest rate. And the interest rate is basically the rate that people have to pay on borrowed money. When the Federal Reserve, for example, artificially lowers interest rates, this starts to send incorrect signals to investors about people's preferences for present versus future consumption. Here's what ultimately happens. Consumers observe a lower interest rate and their preferences haven't changed. So they say, you know what, interest rates are lower, it's not as rewarding to save, I'm going to consume more. Meanwhile, investors observe this lower interest rate and they say, oh look, it looks like people want to consume more in the future and less today. I'm going to borrow money for far future production. Ultimately what happens is you have investors and consumers fighting each other for an insufficiently large pile of resources. That then puts upward pressure on the prices of some goods, and ultimately something's got to give. It turns out that somebody, a consumer, an investor, someone, made a mistake. That gets revealed. When that mistake gets corrected, we enter the bust phase of a business cycle, and that's basically like the recession that we saw in the last part of the last decade. So if you have any questions at all about economics, what economists do, why we do what we do, I'm pretty easy to reach on the internet. Find me at artcarden.com or art.carden@gmail.com. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you, and I wish you the best of luck with the end of a semester.